This video is the extended version on the sphenoid bone. Before we talk about this irregular, very complicated bone, let's talk about the meaning of the name sphenoid. Oid at the end tells you it's like something. And what is it like? It's wedge-like. And why is the sphenoid bone called the wedge-like bone? Well, here's a view of the skull, an internal view of the skull, and you can see the sphenoid bone in yellow. And you'll notice when you look at this view that the sphenoid bone articulates with every other bone in the skull. So it articulates with the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, the two parietal bones, the two temporal bones, and also with the occipital bone. So it is essentially wedged in between all the other bones of the cranium. Hence, it is referred to as the wedge-like bone, the sphenoid. Now let's place the sphenoid bone within the skull by looking at this disarticulated skull, and we'll isolate the sphenoid bone. And unfortunately, I couldn't Photoshop away the ethmoid bone or that wire, but we'll pretend that ethmoid bone is not there and talk about the different parts of the sphenoid bone. First of all, the sphenoid bone has been described as being like a butterfly, like a flying creature, because it has two pairs of wings. And so if we go along with this comparison, you'll see right behind the ethmoid bone, we would have the body of this flying creature. And then we have wings extended from the body, and we have a pair of greater wings first, and then we have a pair of lesser wings. And we also have the landing gear, so to speak, of this flying insect, the legs, if you will. And these would correspond to what are called the pterygoid processes. Now, that's kind of tricky because the word pterygoid, obviously it means it's like something. It's oid, right? So it's like something. And what is it like? It's like wings. So pterygoid means like wings. So everything about this bone is wings, essentially. And we'll see why the pterygoid processes are called the pterygoid processes later. So we can compare it to a butterfly or an insect with two pairs of wings, like a bee, for example, or a wasp, which have two pairs of wings. You could also compare this bone to like a flying plane, a flying aircraft, with the pterygoid processes being the landing gear. Since repetition is always a good idea when you're studying anatomy, let's take another look at the same parts using this plastic sphenoid bone. Now we can see the body unobstructed by the ethmoid bone. And here we have the greater wings. And here are the lesser wings. And we should note that the greater wings will contribute to the wall of the orbit. And in between the lesser wings and the greater wings, we have a feature which is referred to as the superior orbital fissure. We can take a look at how this works in the intact skull. And on the left we have a plastic skull, and on the right we have a figure from Gray's Anatomy. And so you can again note that the sphenoid bone contributes to the wall of the orbit. And in between the lesser and the greater wings, we have the superior orbital fissure, which is essentially a narrow, irregular opening that you find in the upper part of the orbital wall. Now, if we come back to our isolated sphenoid bone, and this is an anterior view, we can see here are the pterygoid processes. If you look at the base of the pterygoid processes, you'll find that there are some openings. First, we have at the base where the pterygoid processes attach to the body. We have a canal, which is referred to as the pterygoid canal. Also over here, lateral and superior to the pterygoid canals, we have an opening. It's a round opening, and we're going to refer to this round opening as the foramen rotundum, which essentially translates into round opening. So now let's take a look at the sphenoid bone from above, a superior view. And to do this, we'll look at a plastic skull. Here's a plastic skull with the top of the cranium taken off, so we can look down at the base of the skull and see the sphenoid bone. So here is the sphenoid bone, but I think you can appreciate that it's hard to make out the boundaries of the sphenoid bone. So let's switch over to this figure from Gray's Anatomy, where the sphenoid bone is yellow. And let's take a closer look at the lesser wings, the small wings. There are a couple of features to note here. At the place where the small wings attach to the body, there are openings which allow for the passage of the second cranial nerve, the optic nerve. And these openings are referred to as the optic canals. Connecting the two openings, there is a groove, and this groove is going to accommodate the place where the two optic nerves cross at what is called the optic chiasma. So this groove is referred to as the chiasmatic groove. It can also be referred to as the optic groove. Let's look again at our isolated sphenoid bone, and this time look at it from a superior view again. And then looking again at the same location, we can again identify the optic canals, and we see them a little bit better here. And again, connecting the two optic canals, there is a groove. And this groove is referred to as the chiasmatic groove, also known as the optic groove. It's hard to see in this specimen from this perspective. At the posterior tips of the small wings, the two processes at these tips are referred to as the anterior clinoid processes. Posterior to these anterior clinoid processes, there are processes associated with a part we'll call the dorsum celli, and these processes are referred to as the posterior clinoid processes. Now, the clinoid implies it's like something. This is a subtle and kind of whimsical way of describing these processes. Why are these processes called the clinoid processes? If it's like a bed, how are these processes suggesting a bed? Well, if you look at all four of the processes together, they're kind of like bedposts. So that's the reason they're called clinoid processes. Again, remember that these anatomists had a good deal of imagination, and who knows what they were smoking in those days. Here is another view of our sphenoid bone, this time using a figure from Gray's Anatomy. And we can isolate the small wings and get a better view of them. And here we have the superior orbital fissure, which would be between the small wings and the great wings. The great wings are attached to the body of the sphenoid bone. If we look near the attachment of the wings to the body, there are three openings. The most anterior opening is called the foramen rotundum, which essentially translates into round opening. The English word rotund means round. The rotundum is simply the Latinized version of an English word, rotund. Or the other way around, I guess rotund is the anglicized version of the Latin word rotundum. Then we have the foramen ovale, and that translates into oval opening. And that should be obvious if you look at the spelling. And then finally, at the very tip or the spine of the great wing, we have the foramen spinosum, the opening in the spine of the bone. Let's review using this isolated plastic sphenoid bone. Let's zoom in and note again the superior orbital fissure. And then inferior to it, we have the foramen rotundum. if we just look at an isolated great wing, we can note again the foramen ovale and the foramen spinosum. So that was a bit of a review. If we go back to our figure, and we can isolate our great wings attached to the body, and then just look at the body. One of the most notable features we'll see on the body is something called the sella turcica, which translates into Turkish saddle. Now, I don't think you can appreciate what we're talking about unless we look at a few other specimens. And let's start off with this figure again. Here is our Turkish saddle, the sella turcica. Now, why is it called the Turkish saddle? Well, here is a lithograph, servant leading a horse, which happens to have a Turkish saddle. It's dressed with a Turkish saddle. And notice that this Turkish saddle, of course, has a seat, but the front and the back of the saddle is very prominent. In other words, the front of the saddle is much larger than what you would see, for example, in a Western or English saddle, and the back of the saddle is very high also. If we return to our plastic sphenoid bone, and again identify the sella turcica, we can identify the parts of this sella turcica, this Turkish saddle. First of all, the part that would correspond to the front of the saddle is referred to as the tuberculum celli, and the part that would correspond to the seat is the hypophyseal fossa, also known as the pituitary fossa. And then finally, the back of the saddle is going to be referred to as the dorsum celli. The significance of these names is that the tuberculum celli simply is stating that this is the swollen part, the tubercle of the saddle, the tuberculum celli. The fossa is a depression, and this depression is going to accommodate the pituitary gland, which is also known as the hypophysis. Hence, it could also be referred to as the hypophyseal fossa. And then finally, the back of the saddle, the dorsum is the back. The dorsum of the saddle is the dorsum celli. Okay, let's review with this specimen, where you might see the tuberculum celli a little bit better. So here again is the sella turcica, and here is the tuberculum celli. So this would correspond to the front of the saddle, which would be higher in the Turkish saddle than it would be, for example, in a Western saddle, where you might simply have the horn of the saddle. Then we have the seat of the saddle, in which the pituitary rests, which again is the hypophyseal fossa, or the pituitary fossa. And then finally we have the back of the saddle again, which is the dorsum celli, the back of the saddle. Now let's finish up with the pterygoid processes. And to get a different perspective on the pterygoid processes, let's look at an inferior view of the skull. So here we can see the two pterygoid processes, and they're going to be flanking the nasopharynx. So the nasopharynx would be located just about right over here, behind the nasal cavity. Notice that these wing-like processes do have a pair of wings. One wing is a lateral wing, and the other wing is a medial wing. So what you have is the lateral pterygoid plate and the medial pterygoid plate. And notice how they're raised up and separated, kind of like the way you would see a pair of wings of, let's say, a butterfly or some insect which can raise its wings. So they are wing-like. Now, the last thing we'll note is something you really can't see unless you cut through the sphenoid bone, which is done here in this sagittal section. So here is our sphenoid bone, and here is our sella turcica, but we've cut through the sphenoid bone, and you can see in the body of the sphenoid bone we have a sinus. And this is referred to as simply as the sphenoid sinus. It's one of the paranasal sinuses. This brings to an end the extended version of this video. I provide a link to the shorter version if you just want to quickly review for study purposes. And again, down in the description below, you could find a link to a quiz that you can take to see how much of this material you remember. Here again are the image attributions. All the images are in the public domain, so I really don't have to attribute the images, but here they are anyway. And you'll also find them in the description below. Finally, here is my assistant, Apollo. I put the word assistant in quotation marks. The bell that you might hear ringing sometimes in the background, well, that's my assistant, who is really not being that helpful sometimes.